Hey, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today I'm going to be responding to Ian Juby's Ian's Sex Video Crevo Rant number 13 from the Wazaloo channel, which is his personal channel. I'll be leaving a link in the description. I have slightly edited this to cut out his rather cringy jokes, as well as a few times where he just kind of repeats himself, and I've already addressed the things that he's saying. Without further ado, take it away, Ian.
Oh, sex is just so embarrassing. Well, for evolution, that is. Evolution has no adequate explanation for the origin of sex.
The origin of sexual reproduction is in fact an area of ongoing research in evolutionary biology. But there are in fact some viable hypotheses, such as the virus-like RNA-based origin, partial predation, vaccination-like process, etc. And sexual reproduction probably goes back to the common ancestor of all eukaryotes, which would have been a relatively primitive single-celled organism.
There are millions of species, the vast majority of which have reproductive systems that are incompatible with each other. Yet we're all supposed to have come from a common ancestor. Bacteria, plants, birds, insects, fish, whales, us. Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of the reason they're different species. If the reproductive systems were all compatible with each other, then they would just be the same species. And what is it about having differences in anatomy that means that something couldn't have evolved? The entire point of evolution is that biodiversity increases over time. The word diversity requires that that be differences. Evolution is an explanation of why things are different, specifically why living organisms are different from other living organisms with which they share a common ancestor.
And look at all of the differences between the reproduction systems of those organisms. So how did we evolve from the primitive organisms that reproduce asexually into two incredibly complex genders that need to interact with each other in order to reproduce?
This type of argument is a pretty common creationist tactic, where they pick something that seems very complicated and say, oh, well, how could X have evolved? It couldn't have evolved, they say. But the thing is that even if we don't know exactly how it did evolve, all that's required to refute this type of argument is a single plausible pathway from a primitive organism to an organism with this trait. So if someone says, oh, the eye is too complicated to have evolved, if you have one plausible evolutionary pathway that's advantageous the whole way through, then the eye could evolve. It doesn't even matter if any particular eye evolved in that way. The argument is still defeated. Since we already have a few hypotheses about how sex could have evolved, we can simply start with simple, now sexually reproducing, multicellular eukaryotes. The difference between a single-cell and a multicell organism essentially comes down to tissue types, because single-cell organisms can group up together into colonies that are still colonies of single-celled organisms. But once they develop different tissue types, now they've crossed the threshold into multicellularity. The most simple distinction between tissue types is between somatic cells and reproductive cells. And in observed instances of single-celled organisms evolving multicellularity, that's the first distinction that occurs. So somatic cells will continue doing things like gathering resources, forming the structural components of the organism, etc., whereas reproductive cells are specialized in going out to create new members of the population. Now, if we start with a, say, haploid multicellular eukaryote, with reproductive cells that are simply broadcast into the environment, which is the simplest method of spawning, and a method that's still used today by many corals and sponges, then it's very simple for such a haploid cell to simply combine with other reproductive cells of the same species into a new diploid organism. There are many advantages to being diploid over haploid, so all that would have really had to happen is for this to happen once, and then the difference between meiosis and mitosis is small enough that there's no particular reason to think that it couldn't evolve. So now we have diploid multicellular organisms broadcast spawning isogamous or identical gametes. There's a slight problem with isogamous gametes, though, in that any two gametes from an isogamous species can combine to create a new embryo, which means if you're doing things like broadcast spawning, you're very likely to have embryos that are the result of two gametes from the same individual merging together. This actually results in less genetic diversity than even the parent had. So any small change to the gametes that will allow them to be divided into two classes that only combine with each other, or even are just more likely to combine with each other rather than members of the same class, can result in a reduction in self-crossing, which will result in a higher level of genetic diversity in the population. This is a fitness increase. So now we have broadcast spawners that have anisogamous gametes, that is, gametes that are different. This difference can continue to grow such that the gametes no longer at all can cross with members of the same group. So now we have male and female gametes, essentially. From here, it's rather simple to develop various strategies to more easily direct spawning. So for instance, you might develop an organ that allows you to spawn different gametes in different directions, or to extend the point where you broadcast them from in distance. So you might have some tube that releases eggs on one side or sperm on the other side. At this point, you're getting pretty close to sex, and in fact, the next step essentially is getting organisms with a dedicated sex, male or female. All this requires is some genetic marker that turns off the gamete production of one kind and on the other, or vice versa. At this point, the organism has eliminated the dangers of self-crossing completely. And now we're essentially at the same kind of reproduction that fish and amphibians use, which is to say that they simply release their gametes in a particular area with a member of the opposite sex, but fertilization is external. But notice that you already have eggs contained within the fish or amphibian's body, and the male fish must have some mechanism for expelling sperm. So it's not much of a leap to go from that to having some mechanism where he simply expels the sperm into the female's body. And now suddenly, through a process of gradual, always improving steps, we've gone from not requiring sex, but allowing it, to having sex be obligate and there be two separate sexes. This isn't a terribly difficult problem for evolution. Now, exactly how it actually happened in the real world is still something that's very much unknown and being investigated, but it doesn't matter because we have a single plausible pathway, so it can evolve.
And remember, this is the reproductive system. It has to work right the first time, every time, or it's the end of the species.
No. No reproductive system in nature actually works 100% of the time, the first time. I'm sure you've met people, Ian, who've had trouble getting pregnant, and the kinds of distress that causes. And yet the human species is still around. The same thing happens in other species. Reproductive systems, like all other systems in life, are imperfect. In fact, if life were intelligently designed by a supremely intelligent being, then we might expect to see actually 100% effective reproduction. But we don't, because the reproductive system of all organisms has been kind of slapped together through natural processes.
Now, bacteria were supposed to be some of the original, most primitive life, and their asexual reproductive system obviously works really, really well, and they can produce huge populations in hours.
In fact, most bacteria can and do reproduce both sexually and asexually. Bacteria come together and exchange genetic material, and then divide, creating new organisms that contain a mixture of the genetic material of the original two. That's one of the reasons that bacteria are so successful, because they can engage in sexual reproduction.
There is no reason for natural selection to select a much more complicated, much more vulnerable sexual reproductive system.
Have you ever tasted something that was banana flavored but didn't actually have any banana in it? You know, artificial banana flavor? Well, if you have, you probably notice it doesn't really taste much like any banana you've ever had. So, how is it banana flavored? There's an interesting little tidbit of agricultural history about bananas. You see, the kind of banana that was around when the artificial flavor for banana was being developed was a different strain than what's commonly available in grocery stores now. But that strain of banana went entirely extinct after a single species of fungus started infecting it, because all of those bananas were clones. There is zero genetic diversity in banana crops. And now, the current banana, the Cavendish banana, is under the same threat. There's a fungus in Southeast Asia that badly affects Cavendish bananas and has recently been detected in South America. So we might be seeing a repeat of the extinction of the commonly available banana. So that right there is a good reason to have sex. The resulting offspring have more genetic diversity than they would have if there were simple cloning. It allows beneficial mutations to spread. It allows detrimental mutations to be less detrimental. And yes, it's more complicated, but if the complications are less costly than the benefits, then it will still be selected for.
Bacteria can reproduce where they are, as they are. There's none of this messing around trying to find a mate. according to the evolution myth, humans, the elephant, the horse, the dolphin, stegosaurus, penguin, frogs, the eagle, the kangaroo, and yes, even the duck-billed platypus all had a common fish ancestor. Now, even among the fishes, reproduction methods vary. Some give live birth, but the vast majority have the female unloading her eggs with the male spraying sperm on them. The fish that grow are completely on their own to fend for themselves. No babysitters required. The fish were supposed to have evolved into amphibians, which have differing reproductive systems again.
Wait, what are the major differences between amphibian and fish reproduction? At least for fish that use external fertilization. Really, the only thing I can think of is that frogs usually mount each other with the male on top from behind, but that's really just because frogs have a dorso-ventrally flattened body, so they can. In either case, there's external fertilization. The young develop in a shell-less, non-amniotic egg. They both develop adult features only a while after hatching. Ian, are you just making things up? I feel like you're just making things up.
And the amphibians were supposed to have given rise to the lizards. Now, lizards also have a whack of different reproductive systems, but most male reptiles have a penis with which to internally fertilize the female. Why? Because unlike fish, the eggs must be fertilized before the eggshell develops.
Okay, a few things. First, modern amphibians did not give rise to modern lizards. Amphibian grade animals gave rise to amphibians and sauropsids and synapsids. Together, those both are amniotes. Further, if we look at the non-amniote members of Sarcopterygi, the group of fish, which includes all tetrapods like frogs and humans and dinosaurs, though a sister group to those tetrapods is actually the modern coelacanth in terms of surviving members. Coelacanths use internal fertilization, not external fertilization. So it's not even all that clear that the common ancestor of all land-dwelling vertebrates, that is the tetrapods, used external fertilization. That could have actually been a regression, quote-unquote, in the Lysamphibian line. But even if it wasn't, you don't actually need an intromittent organ to have internal fertilization. Most birds completely lack any kind of pseudopenis, but they still use internal fertilization. So internal fertilization can evolve with or without a penis, and once it evolves, a penis-like organ can help make the internal fertilization more efficient. You don't have to evolve these two things together. All that's really needed is for a male and female to get their cloacas close enough so that sperm can transfer from one to the other.
Notice what just happened. We just took a quantum leap in complexity. The female needs to develop a cloaca that is compatible with the male's penis and will allow fertilization of the egg inside the female.
Ian, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the average penis/female reproductive tract isn't some kind of complex geometrical puzzle box. For the most part, most animal penises are pretty straightforward, and so are most female reproductive tracts. And in fact, even the complicated ones, like corkscrew-shaped duck pseudopenises, fit into fairly ordinary reproductive tracts. The shape actually does something else, like assist in sperm competition, or make it so that it's more difficult for the female to remove the intromittent organ in question during copulation. Basically, most penises will fit into most reproductive tracts of the female of the same species, or even other species. You know, we get mules. This isn't really the barrier that you seem to be making it out to be. Also, I don't know if you know, but female reproductive tracts tend to be a bit stretchy, probably something to do with laying eggs or giving birth. And so, a variety of different penis shapes can fit inside. In fact, even in humans, your species, the shape and size of male sexual organs varies considerably. And yet, I have yet to hear of a case where someone's oddly shaped penis was the thing preventing them from having babies. Not saying it's impossible, but it's not the most common reason for infertility.
She needs to figure out how to develop a shell on her eggs, but only after the eggs are fertilized. There are complex control systems that need to be made and developed along with this new reproductive system, or it won't work.
Modern organisms that use internal fertilization don't always have eggshells in the style of a bird or a lizard. So it's pretty simple to see how this evolves. First, internal fertilization, because it's more efficient and easier to control than external fertilization, evolves. Next, an eggshell evolves, and the eggshell doesn't start developing until after mating occurs. I don't see why this seems like some kind of barrier. You would have to assume that nothing can ever evolve in order to assume that this has to be some kind of problem.
Independently and at exactly the same time and place on planet Earth, a corresponding male needs to develop a penis, needs to know how to use it, and the female needs to know to let the male use it.
No, every step in this process is gradual enough that no individual with a mutation that will lead to part of the next, quote, step in the process of the evolution of internal reptile-style fertilization is so different that it couldn't mate with members of previous generations or future generations. There is no need for any single generation reproductive isolation in any of this.
Oh, and by the way, the embryo gets its nutrients from the egg itself. Again, remember, according to evolution, this has to happen one small step at a time.
Okay, time for a little bit of embryology. Any egg cell is going to be very, very large. And this is for one particular reason. The first several steps of development in any organism are going to have to all be done fueled with only the energy contained in the initial egg cell. So, for example, when a human embryo develops, after the egg is fertilized, it divides over and over again, but the entire embryo doesn't actually gain in size for quite a while, not until after it implants on the uterine wall. Something similar has to occur with animals that don't use implantation on a uterine wall, that is, almost all of them, where the egg has to be even bigger than in a placental mammal. So, for instance, even an ostrich egg is essentially just a single cell. So, the fact that this single cell contains a yolk, which is essentially just an organelle packed full of fat and protein, isn't very surprising, nor is it a very complicated development. It's simply an extension of the idea that the earliest animals would simply have produced very large gametes. And then, from there, they could simply specialize in making a particular organelle bigger and bigger until it becomes a yolk. Interestingly, placental mammals contain a gene to make yolk that never actually gets expressed. So the fact that an animal has to pack all those nutrients into the egg isn't very remarkable, nor is it very hard to explain. It's extremely straightforward.
Yet if any one part of this incredibly complex system is not there, or even works inadequately, it's the extinction of the species, and the extinction of any evolutionary progression.
Every step from just having reproductive cells go out and be new individuals, to isogamous gametes, all the way through to placental mammal-style reproduction or bird-style reproduction, is completely viable. You can have gametes without yolks. You can have eggs without shells. You can have internal fertilization without a penis. No one single part of this is vital. It might be vital in a current species, so for instance, if you mutated, say, a whole bunch of wolves so they just didn't develop a penis, well, yeah, at this point, they're specialized to the point where that would be a serious problem for internal fertilization. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have internal fertilization without a penis. Birds do it all the time, by default.
At this time, I need to point out a fatal flaw in the thinking of many an anti-creationist. When discussing evolution with them, they often refer to changes in a population, as if an entire population is all of a sudden going to get the same genetic change. Hello! The change happens first to an individual, which then presumably becomes the dominant population. Now, it always starts with a single individual. Only in this case, the changes need to take place simultaneously with the male and female of the organism.
Okay, let's take an example. Let's say we have a population of organisms using internal fertilization but without an intromittent organ. Now, some organism has a mutation, which means that this particular male has a little bit of, say, a little lip sort of structure at the cloaca, which makes it slightly easier to direct sperm into the female. That doesn't require the female to evolve anything in particular. Now, let's say at the same time, or even at a different time, a female evolves that has some muscle which helps retain sperm after it's been deposited. Okay, a little bit later, a few 100,000 years, another male has another mutation which extends this structure that is helping. Maybe gives it a little bit of muscle so that it can be consciously moved. See, at no point do you simply have some animal that, oh, this is the first animal to ever have a penis. Too bad no females know what to do with it. That's not how it occurs. These are very gradual steps, all of which are compatible reproductively with previous generations and future generations for quite a while. And both morphotypes, the more primitive and the more advanced ones, can exist in the same population for an extended period of time.
So let's get it up the evolutionary tree a little more to the monotremes. Monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus, are almost like a cross between reptiles and mammals. The platypus lays eggs like a reptile, yet produces milk for its young. The babies are completely helpless without the mother's milk production system. So now, not only are there radical changes in the reproduction of the platypus also had to figure out how to produce milk, had to evolve control systems for the milk production, which is regulated by the reproductive system. The babies have to figure out to drink the milk, etc., etc.
We've more or less already covered how eggs evolved, and Ian here is not entirely wrong that platypus eggs are pretty much similar to lizard eggs. They both have leathery shells, they have some yolk. The young develop inside, then they hatch. So the real thing here that's different is milk. An interesting thing about platypuses and other monotremes is that they don't actually have teats or nipples. Instead, their mammary glands are just spread across the skin. Well, this is because mammary glands are actually modified sebaceous glands, and sebaceous glands are the glands that produce the grease or wax or oil around hair. So how could this have evolved into milk? Well, let's imagine a proto-mammal, and it has young, and it already secretes a fatty substance onto its fur in order to keep its fur undamaged. But that's fatty, that has calories in it. So any young that developed a tendency to lick that off would get extra calories from their parent. So now we have young who tend to lick the fatty secretions on fur in order to get excess calories. So now we have a selection advantage to make even more nutritious sebaceous secretions, and perhaps to even have more than one kind of sebaceous gland, one that just secretes an oily substance onto the fur, and one that starts to increase the amount of fat and sugar and protein in the secretions. Well, now we have monotreme-style milk, and at this point, the young can start to be born even earlier, reducing the requirements for how much yolk needs to be in the egg, and making it so the young can hatch earlier and earlier in development. Suddenly, we went from regular old lizard-style reproduction in proto-mammals to having a monotreme-style reproduction with milk. Again, no big leaps required.
Both the male and female have a cloaca, and the male's penis has to come out of the cloaca in order to mate. Again, two incredibly complex systems that must evolve perfect compatibility. Imperfect does not work.
Well, they have to be compatible, but they don't have to be perfectly compatible, as we've already gone over.
Imperfect means the extinction of the species and extinction of evolution.
No, all it has to do is work well enough.
Then we come to the placental mammals. Mammals that developed a placenta which nourishes the baby, yet doesn't allow mixing of the blood between baby and mother.
The evolution of a placenta is extremely complicated, and I don't really have the time to get into it here. This video is already going to be very long. So what I will do is leave a link in the description to a paper that discusses the evolution of viviparity, including placentas, in numerous lines of organisms, not just placental mammals. So if you're really curious, go read that paper.
Mammals also have breasts. Where did those come from? It's utterly ridiculous to suggest that perhaps lizards evolved breasts. Only a boob would suggest such a thing.
Breasts are basically just concentrations of mammary glands. We've already seen how mammary glands can evolve from sebaceous glands and how they're still just modified sebaceous glands. So I don't see what the problem is in developing concentrations of them. Also, of course, no one is suggesting that a lizard evolved breasts. Lizards branched away from the mammal side of Amniota a long time before breasts developed. Please stop strawmanning evolution, Ian.
Small step at a time. I have a bone to pick with the anti-creationists, and I don't mean the leg bone, though that would be humorous. I'm thinking of a bone that helps one get it up better than the rest, the penis bone. The males of all the great apes and most mammals have a penis bone. The male gets an erection by contracting muscles on this bone, allowing him to penetrate the female. Yet, somehow, somewhere along the way, a single ape ancestor lost its penis bone and developed a hydraulic system, complete with complex control systems for making an erect.
In fact, no. The corpus cavernosum, which is the erectile tissue in the penis as well as the clitoris of mammals, exists in all mammals. The penis bone, or baculum, or os penis, exists in most mammals. But, like humans, all other mammals get erections through blood filling the corpus cavernosum. The fact that some animals have lost this bone in no way presents a problem for erection or for evolution. Plus, it simply isn't true that contraction of muscles around the os penis is how erections occur in animals with it. It simply allows the penis to remain somewhat rigid no matter what.
The penis bone in mammals shows incredible variety and must be compatible with its female counterpart. The two have to evolve independently, yet at exactly the same time and place on planet Earth.
No, it doesn't have to be some exact match. Like we've already gone over, female reproductive systems can accommodate a fairly wide range of size and shape in male intromittent organs without any significant change to the structure of the female reproductive tract.
Now, some have tried to argue against Adam and Eve, saying their children would be in incest. Now, while that's true, you'll please notice that the evolutionary timeline involves massive incest multiple times. Every time you made any change to a reproductive system, you have to have a completely new, compatible male and female system. The changes have to happen to individuals first, meaning incest for multiple generations, multiple times throughout the evolutionary history.
No, because once again, each one of these steps is extremely minor and is both backwards and forwards compatible, to borrow some computing terminology. So at no point does evolution require significant amounts of incest, or really any. That's not to say that it didn't happen, because we know that incest happens in the natural world, but it's not required.
In fact, if you want to get technical about it, evolution would require bestiality. Because technically, it would be like the first innovator was having sexual relations with a different species.
First, the idea of bestiality is a human construct. There's no idea of bestiality among non-human animals. Second, it would not at all be like every mutant was having sex with a member of a different species, because the variations would be extremely small.
Sexual reproduction cannot and would not evolve one small step at a time. End of discussion. Look at all of the study we carry out on infertility, because even minor things going wrong with the system can mean no reproduction. So now you want to evolve countless and radically different reproductive systems one small step at a time? It cannot happen.
Not only can it happen, it did happen. And I noticed that now you recognize that everything doesn't have to go right the first time, every time, in order for a species to not go extinct. So thanks for contradicting yourself, Ian. I think we've seen now that Ian has presented no problems for evolution here, and that basically, in some cases, he just made things up. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. You can click the little subscribe icon down below this video. If you dislike it, leave a comment telling me why, and still subscribe so you can leave me more hate comments. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.